All right, my name's Brenna Posey. I'm an OCD team member, and we're so excited that you guys joined us. And we have a dear friend and partner of NOCD, Uma. She's amazing. And one quick thing before we get started is that there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so the last 20 to 30 minutes, we're going to do a Q&A time with Uma. We're super excited. People love the Q&A time. So if you have any questions for Uma about her story, research, whatever you want to ask her, she may not be able to answer all of them, but please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And then the last 20 to 30 minutes, we'll dedicate that time for her to answer your questions. So without further ado, let's go. And I'll hand it off to you.
I'm so happy to be here with all of you and happy Mental Health Awareness Month. I wish we didn't have to celebrate it, but if we're going to, we might as well do it in community. So thank you, NoCD, for having me and for everyone for joining so we can talk openly and honestly about this horrific condition that is OCD. I'm someone who I'm sure if you signed up, you saw a little bit about me, but to briefly introduce myself, I first and foremost am someone who lives with OCD. I have lived with OCD my whole life, and I'll talk a bit about my story in just a second. But as a result of my lived experience and finally getting evidence-based treatment 25 years too late, my life completely turned around, and I was able to go from completely debilitated and unable to leave my house and at the brink of ending my life to being able to live out purpose. And a lot of my purpose now is studying this very condition and what's going on in my brain and all of you guys's and everyone who I love who has OCD, as well as other debilitating mental illnesses, and understanding how we can treat it through neuroscience research and all of those things. So, yeah, I'm going to start with how I got here and why I do what I do. And then we can talk all things OCD neuroscience in a way that's understandable. A lot of people share science in a way that's very inaccessible with a lot of jargon. And I am very passionate about communicating it in a way that's understandable to the people who actually care about it, which is the people who are living with these conditions. So to go all the way back to being born, my clinicians, in all seriousness, like it's kind of funny, but my clinicians guessed that I was born with OCD because of the severity with which I've had OCD and how long it's taken for treatment to work for me, but also because of my earliest memories as a human being formed by OCD. From my very earliest memories, I remember feeling responsible for everyone's life. I was afraid that if I didn't do this set of 12 prayers 39 times perfectly, then my parents would not come home alive. I would cause their death. Anytime that there was anything bad that ever happened in the world as a little kid, looking at if someone fell at school, I remember feeling like I was going to kill someone because I accidentally fell and then they fell. And obsessed for now I have the word, I obsessed for like 10 days or something just about what if they died and it was my fault. And I was like 4 years old. I was always so incredibly anxious and afraid of everything, but I was also doing these behaviors, physical and mental, that I just thought were normal. And what's important also to know about my story is that I was born into an immigrant family that was very low income, that had very little resources. And on top of just not having the resources to get me any help, they didn't even have the wherewithal to recognize that there was anything wrong with me. And I'm sure anyone who grew up in an immigrant house or with parents who dealt with adversity can relate to this, that usually our experience is compared to theirs. And because I had the privilege of being born in the United States and not having to deal with the immigration and all of the horrible things that my parents escaped from their country in India, I was kind of just looked at like I should have no problems. And any problems that I have or any fear that I have or just whatever's going on with me was minimized because I'm just a spoiled little kid who has it too good and I have the privilege to get to worry. And I was really born and steeped in that type of culture on top of also being in a culture that didn't at all acknowledge mental health as a thing or mental illness. It was taboo. It was something we didn't talk about. And of course, that's something that still to this day we're working on as a society and in the Western world and in our culture. But take that times 10,000, and that's what I grew up with in that house. And by not just my house, but my community of people that I was exposed to, my support system or lack thereof of family, friends, and kids my age that I was allowed to engage with. So altogether, I was just extremely isolated, extremely alone. And to compound onto that, I was also in a very abusive home with, and this all plays into my story, of course, because OCD latches onto whatever life gives you. And sadly, life gave me a lot as a kid. I was born into a lot of abuse, a lot of violence, and I just believed everything was my fault. And somehow I could try to control my life with compulsions. And of course, I had no language for that, didn't know what compulsions were or what obsessions were. So I was just on the struggle bus for a very long time. I was still functional enough as a kid, but at 12 years old, I ended up going through a prolonged bout of chronic sexual abuse. It's important to name those things, so I'm saying those words. And as a result of that, my OCD brain broke even further. It was already there. It already was running my life, but at least I was functional. But after that, my OCD had way too much more to latch onto in terms of my memory, and I wasn't believed. And what if I'm a liar? What if I'm making this up? What if what if I caused it and all of these things? So I just really deteriorated from there. And of course, OCD often for many people comes with other conditions as well. And given what I just shared with you, it's probably no surprise that I, by that point, had developed PTSD. I was also severely depressed, and I've also been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. But at this point, I think we know that because of how anxious I was. And altogether, I was just completely miserable. I could barely function. I was 12, 13 years old. I was already attempting on my life. And as a result of that, I started getting admitted to hospitals and being taken to these hospitals at the back of police cars because that's what my parents thought was the best way to handle me attempting on my life and trying to figure out how to cope with what was going on. And I was put in these hospitals and I was given diagnoses by psychiatrists and trained clinicians of generalized anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, and panic disorder, which I do have, spoiler alert, but what they hugely missed, of course, was OCD. And it's just so devastating that I mean, I had no language for what I was experiencing. Like I could only tell them what I could tell them, and it was their job. And as we know, as most people know, like we're delayed in diagnosis and treatment because it's the job of trained mental health providers to be able to pull that out, especially as a kid. And no one did that for me. So from that point forth, I was diagnosed with depression, anxiety, and panic disorder, and I was treated as such, sort of, because I also my parents didn't believe in the system and CPS got involved. And long story short, like I was supposed to be in some form of treatment and I was just to fulfill CPS requirements, but I really didn't get the treatment I needed. I was medicated to some degree, but it was not treating what I actually had and the crux of what was going on for me. So now I was in this further strange situation where I learned about mental illness. I mean, I'm at the cusp of millennial Gen Z. So, like, as much as I was in my immigrant household by that point as a teenager, like, I had the internet, I had social media, like, I was all about mental health awareness and raising awareness and all that fun stuff and being an advocate. But so I was fully on board with the idea of mental illness being real. But now I'm in this situation where I'm in a family that's telling me that none of this is real and it's all a scam to get money. And I'm just a whiny little baby. And then I'm deeply suffering, contemplating and attempting to end my life on a daily basis. Thank goodness I did not succeed. Clearly, I'm here, but I was not grateful at the time. And then I'm getting this form of treatment that is supposed to help this mental illness, both medically, or rather through medication, which is easier to understand for a lot of people, like can treat something. But as we'll talk about, therapy is equally as effective in many ways and can change your brain as well. So I'm getting both of these things and I'm not getting better. I'm only getting worse. And all that told my brain, especially with OCD, is I'm actually just a monster, that these things are all my fault. And if these people are trying to help me, these trained, doctors and providers, no one can help me. I must be the problem. There must not be something actually wrong with me. I'm just a horrible person that should die. And on top of that, I mean, now my OCD had latched onto, I mean, I can't think of a theme that I've not had, like for at least 6 months. Like I went to POCD, of course, harm OCD, everything. And we'll get to that. But all in all, I was just completely, utterly miserable. And I had told myself that I just need to get out of my house, out of that abuse that I was in, and then I would be okay. Maybe I could figure it out. And I, became financially independent, got out as quickly as I could. I attempted college at 18 and I barely passed high school. Like I think my teachers felt bad for me and I had enough to get by without doing anything, but literally I don't know how many like things I even turned in school. I had to like go through like suspension just to fill enough hours to graduate because like I had barely gone to school. So I was that dysfunctional at that point. But I was like, I just need to do enough and I was in survival mode. I was so debilitated, but I had to get out of my house. So like I did the bare minimum to work and to get out of my house. I then went to college and that was a complete and utter failure. I tried for 2 years to get to go to college. I was very passionate about mental health, given the fact that I thought I was suffering from mental illness, but also not really. And I was trying to understand myself. And so I was a psychology major and I basically failed all of my classes. I ended up with a 1.83 GPA at the end of those 2 years. The worst of it, I couldn't go to class because a combination of I was so severely depressed that I couldn't leave my room or shower or do anything. But even when I did, I would go to class and my OCD completely latched onto if I don't get every single piece of information down and understand it, then I need to do it over and over again. And I am actually just a monster because I'm going to purport misinformation to other people. It was a very strange OCD looks so weird and OCD makes no freaking sense, but that's what it was doing to me. And so I would, for one of many examples of OCD at that time, I would go to class when I could get myself to. I'd pull my phone out, I would record it, I would try to write every single word down that the person was saying, which obviously, if I'm writing it down, I'm missing what they're saying. So that never worked out. I go back home, I listen to it over and over and over and over, and I would never be able to internalize that information clearly. And I failed everything. And so I internalized that, and I was in more therapy and more dealing with more medication at that time, especially anxiety medications that now we know are not helpful for OCD, but no one figured that out for me either. And I further internalized that I am a horrible person, I am a failure, I can't do anything, and I just need to not be here. So I dropped out, and by that point, I had regressed, or regress isn't even the right word because it wasn't like I moved backward. I was at such a low point that I couldn't leave my home. I was so afraid to leave because if I left, I would have to go do things like get groceries or fill my gas and blah, blah, blah. And if I did that, then I would be stuck there for 10 hours, like literally 10 hours of my day, because I was so like every single thing it took to survive as a human was consumed by what if I pick the wrong thing? What if I do the wrong thing? If I do this, I'm going to be homeless. If I do this, this person's going to die. Like just endless hyper associations in this world of chaos I was living in that I just fully believed because no one taught me that my thoughts weren't real. And in therapy, I was really just taught to try to find the core reason why I'm so anxious. And if I find that deep trauma from within, then I will solve it. And that really doesn't do well for someone who's having intrusive thoughts about things that had nothing to do with my life, and especially harming other people and harming children, harming dogs. Like that's not helpful for anyone. And I usually need to explain that to audiences because I'm not talking to people who understand OCD. So it's actually very nice to just get to say that and move on with myself. So yeah, I at my worst couldn't leave my house, couldn't turn the lights on because I was afraid we were going to be homeless. And then I got diagnosed with cancer, which was even better. I was diagnosed at 22, and it metastasized through past my liver and spleen, and it was very serious. And the worst part of that for me, beyond just like having to live with cancer, was that on the one hand, you when you're diagnosed with something like that, every human being has a primal survival instinct to kick in of like, okay, what now? Like, I don't have time to think about this. I just need to get treatment. I need to do this. I need to survive. And I had that as like part of me. And then what was really scary was that there was another part of me that was it was disturbing how extremely like calm it was because there's a voice in my head that was like, okay, well, this might be like your way out because you failed at ending your life. So this might just do it for you. And it might be liberation from how much you're suffering. And that is a terrifying thing to live with. And looking back, given the life I've lived since then and the recovery I've experienced, like, yeah, for the first time, I'm able to feel some self-compassion for myself of how deeply I was suffering. But that just illustrates how much OCD can ruin your life. And so because of that, go through cancer treatment, and I was not well. And those cancer doctors were like, you need to go into PTSD treatment. They didn't really know what happened to me, but I wasn't functioning well. So went to PTSD treatment, told me, OCD, whatever OCD might be, because like at that point I did a lot of physical compulsions, even though most of them were mental for me. Um, they identified OCD, but they're like, just do the rubber band with CBT and just stop thinking about it. Psychodynamic therapy, find the crux of your thoughts. And it just made me sicker and sicker and sicker. And finally, I was at my lowest point and ready to give up, but I Googled my thoughts again. And this time, for the first time, I learned about what real OCD was and what the themes were, and the three letters ERP that I had never heard of from 22 different clinicians at that point. And it was extremely difficult to wrap my head around the fact that I could have this condition that I thought was just about cleaning, one, and two, that there was a treatment for me that nobody had found for me. Like it's really hard to believe that when I just believed I was a monster, and I can't trust my own reality and my own memory and sense of the world. And I'm really grateful to my past self for taking a chance and trying ERP. It's been a long road because of a turnover with clinicians and leaving practices, and just the complication of my story and how deeply ingrained it was. And that being said, also ERP transformed my life in a way that I never thought was possible. And even just understanding my OCD to begin with, and the fact that it leached into every single part of my existence in life, was it was such a liberating experience. So, all of that being said, I've been in treatment. I'm still in treatment today. As a result of all of that, I was able to go back to school. I had that 1.83 GPA. I was able to retake all my classes, make straight A's, and somehow graduate with a really high GPA. I figured that I just want to understand what's going on in my brain. I kept asking class in my psychology classes, but why? But why? But why? And of course, not really even learning about OCD. And I realized I was interested in neuroscience because I wanted to understand the deeper part of what was going on biologically. And so I became a researcher. I got my master's in neuroscience, started doing research in a lab. That built my research career exponentially because I was studying OCD in a way other people hadn't, which then got me into a PhD program. And that's what I'm doing today. I study the neurobiology of OCD in my lab to understand what's going on in the brain and how we can treat it better. So with that, I know we're getting to the part where people ask me questions soon, but I just wanted to share a little bit about the neuroscience of OCD because it's something that people wonder about all the time, but it's something that is really hard to get information from because most researchers, like I said, tend to talk to other researchers in a way that's extremely jargon heavy. And that's important and necessary for writing papers and for communicating things easily. But I also believe we have a responsibility to talk to the people who care about this work and who it's impacting and who are paying for it. And since I'm both, I understand how to communicate between the two. So I'm so excited to just talk about our brains real quick and what's going on. And the short answer to this, to preface all of this, is we don't know everything. Like we know nothing close to everything. And that's because the brain is the most complex organ in the body. It's really fun to study. And at the same time, OCD is uniquely underfunded in research. And because of the fact that it's so misunderstood, underdiagnosed, and undertreated, things like, or organizations like the National Institutes of Mental Health and other organizations funding research hardly fund OCD research because they don't realize it's important because people don't even in the field don't recognize that it's a real disorder or something worth funding. And researchers are only motivated to go do work based on the funding they can get because that's how we do the work. So all that being said, OCD research is far behind compared to other conditions. So that's a call to action to all of you to help raise awareness for the fact that we should study OCD more. And we deserve better therapeutics and better understanding. But with that, there have been amazing people who have done this work despite being not funded and it not being trendy or cool to study OCD. And everything I'm sharing is what they've discovered over the past several decades. But essentially, our brains, we have different brain regions that talk to each other and they're very complex. And I'm going to share a simple version of it today just to start off the conversation, but just know that these brain regions are extremely complex. They have cells within these regions that make up these regions that talk to regions everywhere. And there's billions of cells talking all the time. But there are something called circuits where certain brain regions talk to other brain regions and then talk to other brain regions and almost create a loop. And it's not necessarily that there is an OCD circuit. There's just circuits all in our brain doing a bunch of different things. And there is one particular circuit that has been shown in a very replicable way to be dysfunctional in people with OCD. But the good news is also there are ways to intervene and help us live a better life through treatment and medication of all kinds. So the circuit I want to talk about is called the corticostriatal thalamic loop. I'm only going to use big words to just name things so you know them, but you can just Google these. It doesn't really matter what the names are so much as what they do. So we have a structure right in the front of our brain, behind our forehead, called the orbitofrontal cortex. And that's our brain's what's important center, and it decides something called salience. Maybe you've heard that in treatment or through psychoeducation, where our brain is constantly trying to figure out what's important and what's not. And typically we're able to figure that out. But in the case of people with OCD, we have intrusive thoughts, or we detect some sort of threat or some sort of fear or some sort of discomfort. And our brain tells us that it's way more important than it is. And it latches on to thoughts that just don't matter. So basically this region is over detecting or exaggerating potential threats. For like if I have an intrusive thought about stabbing my dog, like most people are like, that's a weird thought, ew, moving on. For me, what if I'm a murderer? What if I actually hate my dog, even though I hate this thought? We also have another portion of our cortex, which is more near the midline. It's called the anterior cingulate cortex, and it's less studied in the context of OCD, but it's gaining a lot of attention right now. The ACC is typically monitoring conflict and error. So when it's hyperactive, it can feel way more like something's off or something's wrong, which can feel anxiety or disgust or just rightness and this urgent need to act on it. Both of these regions, but especially the OFC, are then talking to a deeper region in our brain called the striatum. Specifically, I'm talking about the dorsal striatum today, which is part of something called the basal ganglia. You might have heard that term before because people often talk about PANS and PANDAS in the community and basal ganglia encephalitis. That's another hour-long conversation that I can point you to resources for, but all that to say, the dorsal striatum is this deeper brain region that influences habit formation. So it has these two pathways that work at the same time, the go and the no-go pathway. It's called the direct and the indirect pathway. So the go is telling your body what to do, while at the same time, your no-go is telling you what not to do in order to make one action happen. And in the case of OCD, because the OFC is so hyperactive, it's signaling far more to the striatum, which is then kind of making it get stuck in gear so that once something is considered highly salient, the striatum is making someone do behaviors way more and, way more intensely, way more often, way more repetitively than someone without OCD. And it's important to note that this is not restricted to physical actions. This is also mental actions. It's any action that a person takes, including, as many of you might know, mental compulsions and mental rituals, something that I really struggle with to this day. So then this motor center of your brain, this habit formation, is getting really loud and then telling this even deeper part of your brain called the thalamus that all of this was really important and to tell your brain to do it again. So the thalamus is a relay station where it's funneling the sensory information and cognitive information back upward to the front of your brain. And so when you have overactivation of the thalamus, and it's called like purgating essentially, it's letting more intrusive thoughts and all that physiological arousal that goes with those intrusive thoughts, it just makes it happen again and again and again and reinforces a cycle. And it's kind of cool to me, even though I hate OCD, it's cool to me that we have the cycle of OCD, and it very much maps onto the cycle of the simple cycle of the brain I just described to you. And real quick, I just wanted to address a common question, or two common questions I get, one about neurotransmitters and two about genetics. So neurotransmitters, the role that they have in this brain circuit that I talked about essentially is that, like I said, these regions have a bazillion cells in them, and different cells express different receptors, which are things that different chemicals bind to activate or deactivate any cell. And so we have different neurochemicals that when we take a medication, for example, like a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, it's going to broadly affect things like serotonin all across your brain. And so just to say up front, these medications at this time are not like specifically interacting with like one brain region and then changing that circuit directly. It's like impacting the whole brain, kind of like a volume knob that goes up and down. So serotonin, I'm sure you know, is known for mood regulation, and it can, in this case, also modulate how strongly signals in general are getting passed in the loop. And then dopamine is something I'm sure you've also heard of for motivation. It's also important in repetitive behaviors. And in OCD, people think that excess dopamine in certain pathways, especially in that dorsal striatum, the basal ganglia that I talked about, it can fuel behavior further because it's making the basal ganglia more active. And then glutamate and GABA. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter and like broadly in the brain, and GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, but it's not as simple as that because GABA, which is inhibitory, right? It can act on a cell that's an inhibitory cell, and that's like two negatives make a positive. So just when I say glutamate and GABA, don't try to go take supplements or anything like that for them, because once again, they're going everywhere in the brain. It's not doing exactly what you think it's doing. But essentially, in OCD, people think, and medications are being tested right now, such as Biohaven is developing a compound that's actually where Brenna and I met for a commercial release series. That's a whole other story. But anyway, glutamate is seen as something that might be in certain parts of the brain doing a lot more than it should. And so we're trying to figure out medications that can precisely downregulate that in certain areas. And lastly, in terms of genetics, people ask me that question all the time. That's a really long answer, but in some, the purpose, I think it's important to talk about like the reason we care about genes in the first place. Like I think people forget like the relation of genes to neurobiology. Genes like directly dictate how our brain forms and how our cells communicate. And genes are like the little instructions that literally dictate how the cell is made and what the cell looks like and how much the cell is doing, and thus like what the brain regions are doing. And so everything I just described previously in large part is governed or at least created by genes. And then of course there are so many other factors that impact how our brain works, obviously our environment, what we eat, different stressors, different hormones, like all of those things, but genes are a huge part of that. And so with OCD, we up till last week, I would have said we have 0 gene candidates that are related to OCD. A paper just was finally published, and we have like 30, which there's compared to other disorders, the reason why we're so behind once again is because of the money and the issues. And so we need like millions of people in these studies to be able to find subtle differences between the genetics of a person without versus with OCD. And that's because there's not one gene that causes it or one gene that drives it. There's probably like 500 that do so. And so we now finally got to 30 after like 40 years. We have a long way to go, and other comparable disorders have far more work that they've done, but at least it's a start. And it is estimated that OCD is driven by at least 40% of a genetic component, but we're not using the word cause, and it's not the entire part of it. And we can also have gene mutations like without inheriting it from our parents. They're called de novo mutations because people always ask me like, how come no one else in my family has it and I do? Like bodies are weird. They do stuff and sometimes things change. So in some, genes contribute to how our brain works. And we are doing a lot of research right now to understand the function of those genes. It's literally what I do in the lab. I look at the effects of genes that we found in humans and what they do in animal models, which I can answer questions about that if anyone wants to. And altogether, just know that your brain is hugely responsible for OCD, but also your brain can change with proper treatment. We can't cure OCD, unfortunately. I would love for a day where that's true and none of us get to have jobs. I think that we would all love to not have to do this anymore. But until then, we can live a meaningful life with OCD. That my life looks completely different. I know so many people who've reclaimed for treatment and support. And I hope that just a primer on all of that gave you some hope that your brain, it's not a choice. It's not a quirk. It's not something that you caused. Your brain did it, and you can work with your brain. So with that, does anyone have any questions?
Mic drop. That was awesome. Uma, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I think I speak for everyone here. You are incredible and you're doing so much important work for the community. I have OCD too, and it makes me like, it just makes me feel amped up that there's people like you that are out there that I've also experienced it that are doing so much goodness in the community and in research and advocacy. So Thank you for that. We really appreciate you sharing your story. And let's get into some Q&As. Um, how
Thank you.
about, oh, yes, of course. Do you want to look through them, Uma, and answer them yourself?
Yeah, I see a question about medication. Am I on medication? So I'm sure everyone read the disclaimer, but just to say this again, I am not a medical doctor. I'm not a provider. I am speaking from my own lived experience. These are also not recommendations for anybody at all. This is just me sharing my story with as much of a research, ethical based lens as I can while also sharing my truth. So the short answer is no, I'm not on medication. I was deemed treatment resistant to most medications, slash, just did not have a positive response. I also had a lot of negative side effects. And I was very hopeless about that. In part, I felt like once again, there's a theme here clearly. My OCD wasn't real because, or my mental illnesses weren't real in general. Because if that were the case, medication would work for me. And I can tell you as a scientist and as a human, that is not true. That's because medications are really behind it. That's not to scare anyone from medications. They're a great place to start. And for many people, they can be helpful. And the reality is they're not helpful for a lot of people. And that's not because there's anything wrong with you. It's because these medications were not, one, they were not developed for OCD. They're developed for other things that people are using for OCD because that's how behind we are. And that's why we need more awareness and more support and research and funding. I will say that over and over again. And two, because at this point, like I said, medication goes everywhere. And we can't specify where it's going to make a more specific impact on that part of the circuit to then change things specifically related to OCD. So, with that being said, for me, yeah, medication did not work. And I'm grateful that ERP made such a difference for me. And I'm very open about this. And once again, I'm sharing this from my lived experience. What did start to help me personally was the use of psychedelics and ketamine. I have done it in a clinician supervised way. I also study psychedelics and I'm very passionate about that. That's because of my own lived experience. And the from a research standpoint, the reason why I'm very excited about that, and from a lived experience anecdotal standpoint, what I've experienced is that psychedelics are not what they're not the fun, great thing that most people have pointed them out to be for OCD and in trials and for myself. It's more it helps me do exposures better in the actual moment. Long story short, like the entire experience on a psychedelic is me just being faced with all my deepest, worst intrusive thoughts and not being able to do compulsions, which sounds horrible and it is. But the after effects of it, it makes my brain more plastic, more able to change and more malleable, which then lets me do my ERP. And I do hugely attribute that ability for me to intervene with my brain's ability to be less rigid and more responsive to treatment, helping me as well. So not on medication. I do utilize in a clinician supervised way different psychoplastogens, which is a way to reconcile psychedelics and ketamine for myself. And they are being researched right now. So do your due diligence and however you approach that topic. I should go to the next question. Um, I think someone asked, has ERP therapy helped without medication? I think I just answered that. Yes and no. Yes, in that it gave me the ability to engage with recovery and see the light at the end of the tunnel and help me progress to a point. And then by working with my brain, I was able to do ERP even further. There's no world where I would be here without ERP, is what I'll say. What does recovery look slash feel like? How does your OCD interfere with your life at this point?
Good question.
Really great question. I used to look at everyone talking about their lived experience at, not now, but years ago, and feel so alone because it felt like people had a before and after, and that it was so stark and different, and people would talk so often about being subclinical. And the reality is for me, that hasn't been the case. And there's a number of factors that go into that. And so then I'll get to what OCD looks like for me now. Obviously, my life has completely changed and I am a different person and I am so functional. And at the same time, I score moderate to severe on the Y box, which is way better than the extreme that I was stuck in for years. And part of what has prolonged my experience and my treatment resistance, what I'm putting that in quotes because who actually knows what that means, is the fact that I have, well, a big reason is because I have comorbid OCD or comorbid PTSD. That's something that's been discussed in the literature and is being studied right now in terms of why comorbid PTSD might slow down treatment for OCD, while there might be a more nuanced way of approaching ERP versus prolonged exposures. And so that's kind of been like I've had to push through two at the same time to get here. And yet I've progressed so much in that. So for me, at this point in time, I have not seen a reduction in intrusive thoughts, but I've finally gotten to the point where I don't always engage with them mentally. I had gotten a huge grasp on my physical compulsions because it made more sense, but I found myself white knuckling and ruminating without realizing I was ruminating. I just didn't have that insight for so long. And I finally found a provider who could see through me and I couldn't fool. And so right now I have so much more freedom and bandwidth to like do other things and not just ruminate all the time. I would love for a world where I had less intrusive thoughts. Maybe that'll happen, maybe that won't. But yeah, life isn't perfect. I still score, but it's far better than it was before.
Love that. Well, I have a quick question for you actually. Can you explain to everybody here kind of a brief overview of what ERP is, and then how does that affect your brain as we know it right now?
Great question. So ERP is exposure with response prevention therapy from I want to say psychedelic. From a psychology standpoint, it is a subset of cognitive behavioral therapies, but it's really important to note that it's not traditional CBT. So if anyone is advertising that they treat OCD with CBT and it doesn't say ERP, please run away. As someone who went through 22 different people who did it wrong. So ERP is a targeted treatment specifically developed and studied for OCD, where in short, there is exposures and then response prevention. So exposures are facing your obsession, your intrusive thought, whatever it is, insert in the blank, and then not doing compulsions, response prevention, which sounds really simple, but it's actually very, I don't, not in a scary way, but just it's not like you learn it and then in one day you don't have OCD anymore, because your brain, from a biological standpoint, has developed and done the same thing for a long time, or even if not for a long time, it feels so real and it's actually happening in your brain. So it's not as easy as like logicking your way out of it or just understanding it. You have to actually do the treatment, and it requires behavioral change and behavioral intervention to then change the way you interface with your thoughts. So ERP, yeah, it's life-saving, and it's the first line treatment for OCD. Interestingly, head to head with medication, a lot of people ask this as well, because a lot of people would prefer to take a pill only versus having to do this treatment that can often be long and grueling and expensive and difficult until it's not anymore. Unfortunately, medication does not perform the way that ERP does, and head to head, ERP outperforms medication. And there wasn't a massive difference for people who did ERP with medication versus ERP without. That's a big, big study out of Columbia. Um, Medication can certainly help your brain engage with ERP better, but ERP is the first line treatment. And I just have to emphasize that for everybody. Just don't go down the wrong route. I beg you. In terms of the brain, we don't know exactly like how it's changing in response to ERP. And it's not because it's not, it's because there are huge limitations on the way we can image brains as of now. So another PSA is no brain scan can just diagnose or see OCD in your brain. If anyone tries to sell you that, that is misinformation and pseudoscience. We aren't able to just like go sit in a scanner and then be determined like, do you have OCD, or what does your brain look like now versus what does it look like after ERP? And there's a lot of reasons why, but most importantly, it's because the differences in people's brains are so subtle that we can look at different groups of people, like 200 people with OCD versus 200 without, and see differences. Anyway, that's a side tangent on brain scans. But in terms of what we think is changing with ERP in relation to the brain and OCD, by changing your behaviors, like I talked about the fact that we have the oversalience, that part of your brain that's making all these intrusive thoughts super loud and do so much, right? Which is then telling the next part of your brain, the dorsal striatum, to do all these behaviors. This treatment is teaching you to experience that OFC over salience and to not do those behaviors or to lessen them over time. So you're automatically interrupting that cycle and changing the way your brain functions by not doing those behaviors and doing that over and over and over. Because then what happens is you're not doing that behavior, which is then now encoding a new version of that to the thalamus that, oh, like I had those thoughts and I didn't do those behaviors, like I didn't have that same response that I normally do, like I don't need to do this again. And by interrupting that cycle over and over and over, you get to weaken how much they talk to each other and how loudly they do. That doesn't mean that you don't have OCD anymore and that we've cured it. That's why people, unfortunately relapse, and there are so many factors that can go into it, like, if you have a circuit primed for it, even when you engage with treatment, and then you like have a very stressful life event, it can cause that to flare up again. But with the skills we have with ERP and generally treatment and learning how to manage that, we're always able to like do that again and then calm that circuit down. So that's why some people experience less intrusive thoughts. Some people don't experience less intrusive thoughts like I do, but they're able to do those behaviors less. We need to figure out more about like in different people, where in that cycle do you most effectively interrupt it from a biological standpoint via cool drugs or via surgery or whatever. But it's changing the way your brain is working. And I'm sure people have heard the term neuroplasticity. That's a word that's thrown around all the time. I'm glad that there's a word that's gotten out in the world, but to me, I think it's really important to define neuroplasticity beyond just your brain can change itself, because it sounds kind of like aspirational and cool, but how does it actually happen? Your cells are changing at every single moment, your neurons and other types of cells, what most people know neurons. Um, like literally I do something to a mouse and I take its brain out, and it sounds really gross, but I have to do it for this research. And I look at it, I watch its cell change. Like I literally watch the way it looks change and the way the connections it's building to other cells change. Like that's happening all day, every day. There's this myth that your brain changes the most when you're a kid and then you can't really like do anything anymore. And that's not true. Your brain is developing a lot more as a kid, but our brains are changing every day. Think about it. Like if you're going to cross the street and you almost get hit by a car, you're probably going to remember that tomorrow. That's your brain changing. Memories are formed by cells, right? So your brain is able to change all the time. And especially your brain is able to change when you're targetedly, that's not even a word. You're in a targeted way, working to change the way you respond to your thoughts and not do behaviors in a way that's supported ideally by someone who knows what they're doing. So your brain's changing. There's a lot more to learn about exactly how and exactly when, but overall, before after studies have shown changes in terms of what your brain looks like. There's a lot of variables that go into that as well, but your brain's changing. Someone asked, is that an Alex Gray painting? Yes, it is. I'm guessing you know things about psychedelics. Um, let's see, there's so many amazing questions.
There's one about wanting to get involved in neurobiology. I think that would be interesting.
Is that in the questions?
Yes. It was sent at 6:37.
Would you? Oh, okay. So yeah, I have OCD and I am so passionate about understanding the neurobiology of it. How can I get involved as a high school student in the field? It seems really intimidating moving from reading papers to actually getting physically involved with research, but I really just want to be a part of the solution and understand it as much as I can about this crazy condition. I understand you deeply, and that's why I think it's so important for me to share my story in even the smallest form, because there's this misconception and this myth that people who are in my position doing the work that I do are unique and special and really smart and really whatever. Like, no, I literally failed all my classes. I never thought, like, I had to reteach myself basic biology from high school, like as a college student and beyond, because I just didn't like remember anything because I couldn't function. I never thought I would be a scientist. And I also did not have anyone telling me how to get into science. So I totally understand that question. And the fact that you're a high school student is so exciting to me because you have the world ahead of you and so much opportunity. So what I would say is reading papers is extremely difficult for anyone, especially when you haven't been doing it for years as a scientist. And that's really not the way for anyone, in my opinion, to get into science, because a lot of learning how to read papers is by being in a lab and being surrounded by other scientists and having to learn how to have those discussions and literally how to read a paper. Like, oddly enough, we don't read it in order. It makes no sense. So I would just start reaching out to any principal investigators who study anything close to what you want to do or exactly what you want to do and tell them you're a high schooler who wants to get involved in the lab. And that could simply mean that you start off doing the easiest stuff like washing dishes in a lab and working your way up. But just being in that environment and being part of lab meetings and part of journal clubs and just learning how to think like a scientist and getting curious and then starting to assist on some experiments and projects with more senior lab members, especially grad students and people who love mentoring people. Like we love having young people and people who are early in their careers come and work with us because we get to learn ourselves by teaching. So I would not be intimidated by that. We are always welcome. And if we don't have space in our lab or funding or anything like that, because ideally we like to pay you, we will always work to find like, connect you with someone else who could do it. So I think I just hope to support your passion for this. We need more people like you in this world doing this work, as I clearly said at the beginning. And you got this. You are so early. You're going to be okay. If I could do it at like 26 plus, you can do it. Um, Ooh, that's a great question. I come from a family of immigrants as well, and I am first gen. Do you still find it difficult to talk about mental health with family, specifically OCD? I want to talk about it, but given my family's stigma on the topic, I find it super hard. I wish I had a better answer for you, but maybe hopefully my answer at least liberates you to live your truth. To this day, my family still thinks that this is all pseudoscience and that I just somehow got better by, I don't even know, maturing slash I married my husband, and I didn't bring him up in this conversation, but he plays a huge role in my life. They think that he somehow saved me, which might be also cultural misogyny, but that's another conversation for another day. So altogether, yeah, no one believes that I have any conditions. And what's super isolating and painful about it is that I was the sick person who could barely function, who had to somehow figure out a way to pay for my own treatment and how to get my own treatment and be functional enough to do so, as well as like get myself through treatment as, alone without any support. And my heart breaks for anyone who's been in that position. It's such a privilege to have family support you financially and emotionally and even friends. So to this day, no acknowledgement of it being real. I have done a lot of work to understand where they're coming from and their limits, and the fact that a lot of it, honestly, is probably a defense mechanism because of how much guilt they feel for how dysfunctional I was as a result of them not getting me the help I needed. So it's easier to just say it's not real. And I've had to learn how to find support and love and validation from other people, as well as just accept that I'm not going to have that for my family. And I tend to be really loud, and clearly I share my story very openly. I hold nothing back. I mince no words. So I try to raise awareness as much as I can, especially to people who are not white, people who come from different cultures and backgrounds. And at the same time, I've had to just accept that there might be a generational divide, there might be a cultural divide, and that does not invalidate my truth. So it's more that I've had to learn how to accept not being able to talk about it, or rather, I do talk about it, but not being actually understood in it. And I hope that that is not what you have to experience. I hope that in that question, there's a way for you to break through that and help them understand and experience the compassion and support you deserve. But I guess I'm telling you that if you don't get that, that does not invalidate your experience at all. Do you ever still question yourself if you actually have OCD? Every single day. At least the thought comes up. Me engaging with that is my own responsibility. That's my own response prevention or lack thereof. But yeah, I still do, especially in conversations like these where I'm coming in to talk about my OCD or I'm giving a keynote or whatever. Like, and I, especially when people share um, positive feedback and like talk about how much whatever I said supported them, my OCD immediately latches onto like, I'm just making this up for attention. And but I'm like, I wish I was that creative to to make that up. Um, let's see. I love how many questions you guys have. Um, if you had to change one thing or if you had one thing to change your OCD, what would you change about it? Like a tool? Or what would I change about my OCD? I guess I'll answer both. If I had one thing to change my OCD, it would be something in precision psychiatry, which is where we do the opposite of what I explained current medications do, where we're able to precisely intervene in certain cell types in a certain brain region or regions and specifically attack OCD and not just the entire brain and hope that it helps OCD. That would be amazing. If you're asking what I wish I could change about my OCD, I mean, like not having it would be great. But if not, I wish mental compulsions weren't a thing. I know that they, like, when you get a grasp on them, you can treat them just like physical compulsions, but it's hard to not feel like thinking is passive. Like, it's really hard. I mean, I think it's a beautiful realization to have as a human that not all of your thoughts are real and like engaging with your thoughts is your choice. I think that's a philosophical thing that we all could use as humans because how much in the world is, how much suffering is caused by people just like believing whatever pops in their head. So, yeah, I guess I would change that. Let's see. Do we have time for some more questions?
Maybe like one more. Yeah, that'd be great.
Um, how do you map the temporary relief part of the OCD cycle onto the CSTC loop? How do you explain that? Great question. So there's uh, th- that's there's a lot packed in there, but I guess one part I'll hone into is I hate bringing up dopamine because it's so often used as like a feel-good chemical or something that is like talking about motivation, and it's far more complex than that. In this context, there is dopamine released in both the dorsal striatum, the whole motor area, as well as a part I didn't talk about so much, the nucleus accumbens. It's another part of the striatum that's part of reward learning and behavior. And when you do those behaviors, dopamine is released into that circuit, which is then not only affecting your behavior, but also how you feel. And there is temporary relief from that release, except of course, it's temporary because then it's causing that cycle to happen over and over and over again, and it's stemming from distress in the first place. So there are ways to map onto it. And conversely, for those who are so treatment resistant that they have to get deep brain stimulation surgery, which is brain surgery that implants electrodes into specific parts of your brain to try to change whatever. In the case of OCD, that's actually one of the only forms of precision psychiatry we have, which is why I hope we can develop something that's not, surgery. But all that being said, the target that has been most effective is that nucleus accumbens, that reward center, which is not directly implicated in the CSTC circuit, but it's trying to change the amount of reward we get just generally so that we're not necessarily needing to get it from doing compulsion. So that sort of, and it's not that it's simply not part of the circuit. Like I said, I talked about that loop, but you have to think about the fact that every single part, every single brain region, first of all, they're subdivided into like a bazillion brain regions within like the OFC, for example. But two, they're also talking to like a whole bunch of other brain regions at the same time. People bring up the amygdala all the time in OCD. For example, long story short, obviously the amygdala is involved with fear. First of all, the amygdala is like 12 different things, in case you didn't know that. Two, it's a fun fact. Two, it's involved in fear and anxiety. And a lot of people with OCD experience anxiety in conjunction or as a part of their obsessions, right? However, the amygdala is not like directly implicated in the circuit, yet the amygdala can be hyperactive when a part of that circuit is talking to the amygdala, yet at the same time, not everyone's OCD manifests as anxiety. So that's why we can't say that it's part of the canonical circuit or amygdala doesn't even like work as a DBS target. So that's another tangent. I got way too much in the science, but essentially, there's not a clean way to map on the relief, but the dopamine part is one aspect of it.
Wow. This just makes me like want to go back to school and read more about OCD, and it's just so freeing. Coming from someone that has OCD, just learning more about kind of what's going on in my brain, and but also knowing that like there are treatments out there that can help you and help you manage the symptoms to live a full and beautiful life. There was a part in my life where I did not think I would be able to be here today. My OCD, kind of like you were saying, I just wasn't able to function. Um, I didn't know how to move on with my life, truly. And I had done talk therapy before, and it actually made me worse. So they would just, like you were saying, snapping the rubber bands. My compulsions were all mental. and I could not get myself out of it. And crazy enough, I found NoCD on Instagram around COVID. COVID really triggered my OCD as well, but I didn't even know it was OCD at the time. I think that was the hardest part is that no one could tell me, like you were saying, that what you're going through is actually OCD. And I got connected to NoCD and got a lot of hope because I finally knew what was going on. And then also got a lot of hope because I found out that OCD, there is a therapy out there that is specialized for OCD and it's ERP. And for those of you listening right now, if you are interested in learning more about ERP or OCD, we're going to drop a link in the chat right now. And feel free to give our team a free call. Whenever I got connected with NoCD, the process was seamless. I got matched with a therapist, quickly got started in ERP. It was all virtual. We are in every state. Check to see if we're in your country right now. And then ERP changed my life quickly. And I was able to get support in between sessions. I could message my therapist, support groups, in-app tools, so much. And I think I'm just so passionate about it now because I know where if you're listening to this and you're struggling, we get it. Like I get it, Uma gets it. We know how debilitating OCD is, but it does not have to be that way forever. There's support, there's people, there's therapies out there that really can change your life like it did for us. So here to tell you that it can get better. And again, an OCD is covered by over 60 insurance plans now, which is great. We're hoping to have more, obviously. Please give our team a free 15-minute call from the link in the chat. We would love to chat with you. So hopefully you can get started on your journey. Anyways, Uma, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you. Your story is incredible. You are strong, and we just appreciate you speaking on behalf of everybody for all the work that you're doing because it takes a lot of people. And I love how you're so passionate about it and you have the lived experience behind it. And you're able to come to work and be like, all right, this is what I'm here for, like this is my life. And I just find that amazing. So again, thank you. We love you, Uma, here at NoCD. Again, this whole Zoom recording is recorded. And so we'll send it out to you guys. If you have anyone in your life that would be interested in learning more, please send it to them. We want to get the word out. And especially because it's Mental Health Awareness Month and everyone deserves awareness of what they're going through. So please send this out. Thank you guys so much for joining. Thank you again, Uma, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. And feel free to connect with me on social media or my podcast or wherever. I'm happy to answer questions anytime.
Yes. Oh, do you want to say your Instagram so people can, yeah.
Yeah, I'm everywhere at Uma R Chatterjee. That's UMARCHATTERJEE. My website's that.com. And my podcast is called A Chat with Uma, where I bridge research and lived experience with a lot of cool people, including people from OCD.
Love it. Yep. Check her out. And if you're interested, our Instagram, our socials are at Treat My OCD. We also have a free app to download for support and online community. So please check us out. Again, thank you so much. And everybody have a great rest of your Tuesday evening.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.